Good afternoon and welcome to the Legacy Project. Once again, this is our 8th project over 3 years, and we've filled the largest space on campus pretty much to capacity. We're really proud of that, and we're really happy that you've joined us today for what should be a really engaging lecture and discussion on prison reform. Our keynote speaker, who I'll introduce a little bit later, Glenn Martin, is someone who's very sort of interested and actively working in this field, and we'd love to sort of hear what he has to say. Just a few sort of housekeeping items. This is a great time to turn off your cell phone. We're only going to take 75 minutes of your time. We'll get you out in time for a 2 p.m. class if you're a student. So if you can please turn off your cell phone. And for the students who are in the crowd, you received a program but also an extra credit form. So we don't have you sign in anymore. You'll see that on the extra credit, there's just a few simple questions for you. And on your way out, we will sign that form for you, and you hand that to your professor for extra credit, if that is the case of why you're here. I think you're going to find today very engaging, though. And before we sort of begin with our keynote address, I'm honored to sort of introduce Professor Jerry Klobe of the Sociology and Economics Department here. He's going to give you some sort of background on prison reform. So, Professor Klobe.
I want to thank the Legacy Project for the last 3 years for bringing some very interesting and informative speakers to campus. They're good for all of us, good for students, but also good for faculty. We found it very inspiring in some cases. Hopefully today's talk I'm sure it will fit in that mold, and you'll get a lot out of it. I also want to thank the Legacy Project for allowing the Sociology Department, Sociology, Economics, and Anthropology, to have the opportunity to make a few comments. These will be pretty short, probably less than 5 minutes, but the idea is to provide a little bit of context, some comparison, and maybe to raise some provocative questions, hopefully, and give a little bit of sociological perspective. I don't think the irony has escaped many people nowadays in 2016 that in the land of the free, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, or technically, I suppose, the second highest incarceration rate. Only one country locks up a higher percent of its people than the United States, and that's the tiny nation of the Seychelles, which is in the Indian Ocean, a country of less than 100,000 people. The United States incarceration rates exceeds that of any comparable wealthy democracy. Our incarceration rate is 10 times higher than the Scandinavian nations, and it's roughly 6 or 7 times higher than many of the Mediterranean nations. And not coincidentally, our rate of economic inequality is much higher than those nations. Our child poverty rate is vastly higher than most of those nations, and the level of economic insecurity in the United States is quite a bit higher. Our rate of incarceration is also quite a bit higher, in many cases a lot higher, than some nations that we consider repressive states. What are the consequences of this? Well, contrary to what a lot of people might think, the higher rates of incarceration, getting tougher and tougher on crime, really doesn't seem to be very well connected to our crime rates. Right? In fact, there are even some studies that suggest incarcerating minor offenders may increase the recidivism rate. So it's also pretty clear, especially during this primary season, that more and more Americans seem to feel the economy is rigged, and not only that, but the justice system as well. And in addition, the political system has become more and more exclusionary. So there is an opportunity to rethink these policies and perhaps opportunities to create change, reform, major reforms. But think about the consequences of mass incarceration for a little while, and I'm sure Glenn will talk about that quite a bit, so I'll just say a tiny bit. Individuals are, they're labeled, they're stigmatized, they're blackballed, They have difficulties getting jobs, in some cases even difficulties getting housing, and they may have their voting rights stripped in many states across the country. So they become politically disenfranchised and without economic opportunity, without a political voice. But also consider mass incarceration. Who gets incarcerated? Most of the people are of lower income, lower socioeconomic status, often minorities. And contrast that to the way corporate offenders are dealt with by the justice system. There's a tremendous contradiction between the vigor with which street crime is prosecuted and punished and with which low-income and minority Americans are jailed, and that stands in disturbing contrast to the way destructive corporate crime is ignored or given an occasional slap on the wrist. In 2006, the press reported that corporate offenders owed the federal government $35 billion in fines. Now keep in mind, they're often not they're not charged frequently with violations of wage laws or pollution to the environment, things like that. They owe $35 billion in fines to the federal government, and in many cases just simply do not pay. Last week, Senator Elizabeth Warren her office issued a report, Rigged Justice 2016, How Weak Enforcement Lets Corporate Offenders Off Easy. It is fairly brief. I recommend, if you're interested, follow up. It's not hard to find online. And one of the things I found most interesting, or you might find most interesting, is that two of the cases she discusses, or her people discuss, are fraud in student loan companies, student loan management corporations. But again, in these two cases that she mentions, the settlement, which was pursued not through a criminal case, but basically outside the courts, in which the companies don't have to admit any guilt, the settlements were much smaller than the damage done to students who were the recipients of these trap loans, so to speak. Okay. So today, you'll walk away with more insight into the issue of mass incarceration, and I hope I contributed some thought or some ideas for follow-up discussion as we go back to our classes later or next week, so on and so forth. But right now, I think John's going to come back up and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Klobe. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. Glenn E. Martin is the founder and president of JustLeadershipUSA, an organization dedicated to cutting the U.S. correctional population in half by 2030. Just Leadership empowers people most affected by incarceration to drive policy reform. He's a national leader, a criminal justice reform advocate, and a frequent presence on cable news and NPR. We're really honored to have him here to hear what he has to say, and after his lecture, we invite you to ask some questions. Mr. Martin, welcome to CCM.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Oh, thank you. That was kind of Twilight Zone-ish. I was like, am I alone here? So it's great to be here. First of all, thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you to the organizers for inviting myself and Just Leadership into this space. This is a great audience. My name is Glenn Martin, and whenever I hear people speak, I often... So I didn't write a speech, and I didn't write a speech because I think young people can see through all that. So I figured I would just speak extemporaneously about who I am and what I do. So when I hear people speak, I like to know a little bit about who they are to get a sense of where they're coming from. So I'll start with a little bit about me. My family's from the Caribbean, a small island called Grenada, and I was born in the United States. This is going to get better, actually. This is going to get very TED Talk-ish. Just let me know when you're ready. This guy's no joke. And so I have two brothers, one older, one younger. And we spent about 6 or 7 years in the Caribbean, even though I was born in the United States in Brooklyn, New York, and then came back to live in a place called Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s was just a really, really tough place to grow up, a really tough place to live, a place that was mired in poverty, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of over-policing, over-incarceration. And for me, it was a little strange. My father's white, my mother's black. My father was a police officer for his entire career outside of the United States. And then my mother, so we grew up in a single-parent household on public assistance for many years. She fought really hard to try to get off public assistance. Sometimes she did, found herself back on public assistance because the low-wage jobs didn't come with fringe benefits and so on. And so the streets had a really hard pull on myself and my older brother in particular. My younger brother's about 8 years younger than me, so it was really my older brother and I, who are a year apart, that grew up together. And at the age of 17, when he graduated, he went right into the military. And this is going to be important. If someone could sort of remind me later and say, like, what happened to your older brother? He went into the military at age 17. And then my younger brother and I graduated high school. And by the time I graduated high school, I found myself hanging out with people who were selling drugs, doing shoplifting, you name it, a bunch of different somewhat petty crimes. And at the age of 16, I got arrested for petty larceny and shoplifting and found myself at a place called Rikers Island. Anyone ever heard of Rikers Island? So the thing about Rikers Island is that it's the second largest jail in the United States. When I was there were 23,000 people there. I was only 16, because in New York we charge 16-year-olds as adults. We're one of only 2 states in the United States that does that. And so it means you go into the adult system at the age of 16, and judges don't have any discretion to do anything about that. And when you walk onto Rikers Island, shackled, as soon as you get there at the age of 16, you quickly have to make a decision. You either have to be predator or prey. And you have to make that decision really quickly. The Department of Justice issued a report about Rikers Island recently saying that it had a culture of violence and a Lord of the Flies-like atmosphere. And for me, it was tough to read that because it actually reflected my experience 21 years earlier, which for me means at least 2 decades of human carnage, particularly to young people of color. So now today there's 9,800 people there serving time. 80% of them are detainees. That's the other thing to remember. When I said there were 23,000 of them, the majority of them, over 80%, are there as detainees. So they're charged with a crime, they're not convicted of anything, and they're subject to vast amounts of violence. What I didn't say to you is that the day I arrived there, I was in a cell and the guy said to me, "Can I have your leather coat?" And if you give up your leather coat in that moment, you will probably not be able to come back from that. And so I had a fight with him, and that resulted in 4 stab wounds in my body that I still have today in my neck and in my back. And even at the age of 16, I just thought to myself, something seems wrong with this situation. You know, whether you did something wrong or not, the fact that you get sent to a jail where your safety is in jeopardy every moment while you're there, and your human dignity is taken away as you cross the bridge to Rikers, felt problematic to me, even at the age of 16. So if you fast forward a bit, I just kept going down the wrong road to the point of getting arrested for a much more serious crime in my early 20s, robbery. And I served another year on Rikers. And the thing about human beings is that they're pretty resilient. And even in a really tough situation like being on Rikers Island, you sort of learn how to survive and you learn how to do it quickly. And so by the time I served a year on Rikers, it was a bit different because I had learned how to survive on Rikers. And then I went to state prison to do another 5 years, so that's 6 years altogether. And when I got to state prison, a correction counselor took a look at my grades and said, "Wow, look at your grades. You should go to college." And it was the first time anyone had ever said that to me, in a prison, at orientation. A person who arguably was going to see about 300 or 400 people coming through that day, but someone who took a moment to see something in me that I didn't even see in myself in that moment. And then by the time I got transferred to the prison where I was going to do the rest of my time, 10 hours away from New York, way up by Canada, I found out there was quality 2-year liberal arts program at this prison, even though college and prison was taken away in 1994 by then President Clinton through the Violent Crime and Control Act. So I was lucky to arrive at a prison that had a college program that was privately funded. And so people often ask me, like, Glenn, well, how did you turn your life around? Because 2/3 of people who come out of prison go back at some point, right? This is the only industry I know with a 66% failure rate that not only continues to operate, but we continue to feed it resources. And I want to talk a bit more about that and what sort of perverse incentives would drive an industry to continue to operate like that. And so I'm in class one day, and the thing is, when you grow up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, just like you learn how to survive on Rikers, you learn how to survive in that atmosphere. And there's a multi-generational narrative that exists in communities like that. And for me, it went something like this, and I think there's some variation of this for a lot of particularly young people of color who grow up in poor communities, that I live in a country that doesn't care much about people with dark skin. I live in a country that has a serious amount of white privilege in place. I live in a country that I feel like I don't owe anything to because it doesn't feel as though it owes me anything or cares about me as a citizen. And so therefore, everyone who's not like me, I don't need to be concerned about. And if I'm not valuable, then everyone who looks like me is probably not valuable either. And that was the narrative I grew up with. And it was the narrative that a lot of people in my community grew up with. And then I get to prison, I'm sitting in this class, this liberal arts course, and I'm looking at this video, and it was about the Holocaust. It's not like I had never heard of the Holocaust, but here was a video with actual footage from the concentration camps. And it gets to this point in the video where this piece of bulldozer equipment pulls up to dead, naked human bodies stacked about 4 high and shovels them into a hole in the ground. And it was a moment for me where the narrative I grew up with suddenly wasn't applicable. Can I lose this mic now? Yeah? Can you guys still hear me? No. Okay, I'll keep going with this mic. And so people often ask me, like, well, what was the moment where you turned your life around? And, I talk about getting a college degree, but that was just part of it. The other part was the human being who said to me, you should go to college. And as someone who's done this work for 15 years since I exited prison in New York State, what I have found is that we're trying to find this silver bullet way of helping people to not go back to prison. In fact, it was George Bush during the 2004 State of the Union address that said to America, we have 630,000 people exiting our prisons each year, and this is the land of second chances, and we need to make sure they land back in our communities with the things they need to do well. And he talked about housing, and he talked about jobs, and he talked about education, employment. I wish he would have talked about education, actually. And that encouraged Congress to do something. And what Congress did was to create this thing called the Second Chance Act, which is a bill that was passed with huge bipartisan support. And I think there was huge bipartisan support for a couple of reasons. One, George Bush was in office, and he was the one suggesting we need to do something different. And I think that came from his values, his faith-based values, believing in redemption. And it created a space for conservatives to start saying, well, maybe I can help people when they're exiting prison without looking soft on crime. And the reason I bring up soft on crime because the politics of mass incarceration are extremely important. Because if you're just looking at the data, nothing makes sense. Because the data actually suggests that everything we've done for the last 4.5 decades makes no sense. And yet at the same time, going back to my original point, with all the programs that we've created around the country since George Bush pushed Congress to do that, to push that bill forward years ago, we spent $475 million. But when I used to work at a place called the Fortune Society as the vice president, a very large reentry organization, and I would meet people who were successful in those programs 5 years later, 10 years later, and I would say, like, Mike, tell me what about the Fortune Society worked for you? What part of our program really helped you turn your life around? And no one would say, like, oh, Glenn, it was that your analysis test, like, really did it for me, tested me every day. No, they would say it was Vilma. It was Vilma who sits at the front desk, the receptionist. When I walked into Fortune Society, she said, welcome home. And no one had ever said that to me before. And so the same way you have these moments in your own lives that you remember that are like these turning points for you, it's the same thing for people who've been involved in the criminal justice system. And for some people, they had a child while they were in prison. Some people lost a parent while they were in prison. Some people had someone tell them they should go to college while they were in prison. And we've enjoyed sort of 4.5 decades of like this tough on crime narrative that probably makes what I'm saying sound like really mushy, like, come on, that's not what people need. They're using drugs, they're robbing people. And I hope when we get to the Q&A that there's a couple of people in the audience that are like, this guy's full of crap. Like, I can't wait to ask him a question. Because I want you to challenge me on some of the things that I'm saying out loud. Because there has to be someone in the audience that's like, what about the victims? What about the victims? And you should ask me that question, actually. So here I am in prison, and in prison in New York State, it was overcrowded at the time I was there, just like Rikers Island was overcrowded. And the first thing I noticed was how many people of color were in prison with me. The second thing I noticed was how many people of color were in prison with their fathers and their grandfathers in the same prison sometimes. The third thing I noticed was how poor people in prison were. And the last thing I noticed was that we lock up some of America's best and brightest. And I don't think people say that out loud often enough. I think if we're going to break out of where we are now in terms of locking up so many people, like we have to start telling the truth about who ends up in prison. And so I, of course, met a lot of people who were going to college while I was there. They were in the college program I was in. But I always like to tell this story of this guy named Arthur who I met in prison. So I talked about mass incarceration being about 4.5 decades old. So that's the other thing. We haven't been locking people up at this rate forever. This is a pretty recent phenomena. And we got here through our democracy. We made decisions, right? And that should be empowering to you, because when we get to the end of this talk, I want to talk about what people can do to undo mass incarceration. So we got here because as a country, we made a set of policy decisions. And because it's only been 4.5 decades, we can actually pinpoint the decisions we made, right? 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing, prison privatization, mandatory minimums. So here's my mandatory minimum story. I'm in a cell. I'm being driven from one prison to the other. And in New York State, on any given day, there's a prison worth of prison guards on the road, moving people around. And because the unions are pretty strong. In fact, on Rikers Island right now, there's 9,800 people detained, and there's 10,200 correction officers. So there's more than one correction officer for every person serving time. So that's about the politics of mass incarceration. I want you to hold on to that for a second. So so as you travel from one facility to the other, it can be 10 hours away, but it can take 2 or 3 days. And so you drive for a few hours, and then you go to a different prison, and you're let in shackles, and you're with a bunch of other people that are shackled. And I got to this prison called Auburn in New York. And, you know, think of like your scariest version of a prison, like really high walls, guard towers, dark cement, like just weather beaten, dark cloud on top, lightning bolt coming down. Like that's the kind of prison it was. I was like, oh, wow, like this is the real deal. And then we turn off the road. We're in the middle of this picturesque town. And as soon as you make the left, boom, the prison. And they march us into the prison, and there's this long tier of cells. Like, you see how dark it is over in this space? Like, just imagine that going on for like 100 cells. And then there's these windows right on top in the front. And you get led to the cell, you take your shackles off, and they tell you to go in the cell. And that's when you realize you're actually in the cell with someone. Sometimes you're in a cell with 2 people. Cells are really small. They're like 8 by 10. And I get in the cell, and there's a guy there, and, you know, at first you're standoffish. And then you realize I'm going to be in the cell with this guy. In my case, it would have been 2 days because I got there on a Friday. And so you want to know, who are you in a cell with? And his name was Arthur. And I started to talk to Arthur within the first few hours to get a sense of who he was. And so he also got locked up when he was 16. And he got locked up under what we call New York State's Rockefeller drug laws. Anyone heard of Rockefeller drug laws? So Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor in New York State back in the early 70s, wanted to show how tough he could be on crime. First, he was investing in treatment, and then when he wanted to run for president, he decided that tough on crime was the way to go. And he introduced a set of laws called the Rockefeller drug laws ultimately, but they were about mandatory minimums. Anyone know what mandatory minimums are? Here's the thing about mandatory minimums. They take the discretion away from judges. You almost got to ask yourself, like, why do we need a judge in the court if in the end the judge has no discretion over how much time a person serves? But that's what Rockefeller drug laws are about. It was New York State's governor and elected officials saying, you know what, we know better than the courts about how much time people should do. And if you're convicted of a crime, we don't want to know about the circumstances, like you're going to get this amount of time. And for many people, it meant double digits, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. And in Arthur's case, it meant 25 years for 2 kilos of cocaine in the trunk of a car. And he had to make this decision when he was 16. And the decision he made was not to take the plea. Most people take pleas. In the federal system, for instance, 96% of people take a plea. So you watch Law and Order, like, it's not like Law and Order. You don't get arrested and you have a great lawyer and they're debating and in an hour, everything is over, right? Like, it takes months and months and months, sometimes years, and the prosecutor puts you under a tremendous amount of pressure to make a decision because you're facing a lot of time. And Arthur was 16, and he was like, I'm going to go to trial. And he went to trial, and he got 25 years. And when I met him, he had 17 in. So he was about 34, right? 33, 34. And he said he became addicted to drugs in prison, and he's also suffering with mental health disease. He was actually getting medication through the prison cell from the correction officer, Thorazine he was taking for a mood disorder. And we started talking, getting to know each other, and he's Latino, he was from the Bronx. He grew up in a family where everyone was selling drugs. At the age of 6, 7, 8, he could remember his parents and his grandparents selling drugs out of the kitchen of the apartment he lived in. And so I talked about how the windows on top of the prison cells were open all the time. And I started to get sick, and I started to cough, and it got really bad. Like, I said to myself, wow, I'm stuck in here for 3 days, and clearly, like, I'm coming down with something serious. And at one moment, Arthur looks at me and he says, oh, you're getting sick, man. He said, do you want me to make you a cup of tea? I was like, I want you to call the correction officer to get me out of here. How are you going to make me a cup of tea in this cell? And he says, serious, if you want a cup of tea, I'll make you a cup of tea. And he takes an empty plastic bottle that's in the cell with us, and he goes over to the sink in the cell, and he fills it with water, and he ties a string from the bottle to the light fixture in the cell. And then he takes the mattress off the bunk, and he takes a roll of toilet tissue and rolls it really tightly. And then he takes a pencil that he has, and he uses the outlet in the cell to heat up the lead in the pencil enough to light the toilet tissue on fire. And then the bottle hovers over the toilet tissue just high enough that it begins to spin and it begins to melt, but it doesn't burst. And then the water in it begins to boil. And then he rips open the collar of his prison outfit and pulls out 2 tea bags and puts it in the bottle and hands me a cup of tea. Here's why I tell that story. I tell that story because if you notice, I've been up here for maybe 15 minutes already, and I haven't said convict, I haven't said ex-offender, I haven't said inmate, and I haven't said prisoner, and I haven't said any of the words given to us by the system to refer to people in the system. Why? Because if we can't humanize people who end up in prison in this country, we'll never end mass incarceration. If they're just inmates and animals and thugs, and all of the dog whistle words that we tend to use to refer to people who end up in the system, then who cares? And if they're that scary, I don't care what it costs to lock them up. But if they're human beings, and if they're anything like us, then we stop for a minute, and we start saying things like, wow, if that were me, or if that were my uncle, or if that were my aunt, and then it creates a different conversation. And how do I know? Because if you look historically in this country, that's how movements are built. Movements have faces, movements have stories, movements have narratives, movements have real people, and movements have people who are not directly impacted by an issue, standing alongside people who are, because they feel connected through their humanity. But we don't get there if we don't tell stories. So the story of Arthur, for me, is a story of someone who probably should have been in a position to say, you know what, this system has done everything to crush my hope, my humanity, my lifetime opportunities. And yet that's not what he said. He said, I see another human being in this cell with me, and he's getting sick, and I know how I can help him because I've been in prison so long. I know how to make a cup of tea in a cell, and that's what he did. And so I always hold on to that story because I try to remind people that even in a situation where most people would just be like, F everybody, he didn't say that. And he showed me a level of compassion that some people haven't shown me who were nowhere near that situation that he was in. The other reason I tell it is that even if you don't care about this stuff from a social justice perspective, talk about human capital down the drain. 65 million Americans have a criminal record on file. That's a staggering number. And so punishment is not just when people are in prison either. If you guys have criminal justice courses, I'm sure you've heard the term collateral consequences. Anyone? So what are collateral consequences? Collateral consequences is Glenn Martin, 15 years after being out of prison. I've drafted legislation, gotten it passed in 10 states around the country. I sit on the governor's task force in New York State, appointed by the governor to that task force. I meet with the Attorney General's staff once a month for the last year and change. And the other day I moved into a new building and there was an application to use the gym, and the first question was, have you ever been convicted of a crime? That's what collateral consequences are. The idea that there are all these entities outside of the courts that are punishing people well beyond the punishment meted out by the courts. Collateral consequences is Glenn getting off parole many years ago and then applying to vote and being told by the Board of Election that I can't vote. And that happens all across the country. And it differs from state to state, but it's worse in the South. It's worse in most of the states that held on for dear life to slavery and Jim Crow. If you don't believe me, look it up. Pick any collateral consequences. Barriers to voting, barriers to housing, barriers to education. You know what I say? The criminal justice system right under our noses. You know, we celebrate the Civil Rights Act. The criminal justice system has almost eviscerated the gains from the Civil Rights Act for 65 million Americans. How? Well, let's think of what I call the 4 E's: education, employment, enfranchisement, equality. If you have a criminal record, with all the criminal record discrimination that exists in this country, most of it statutory, some of it practical, it takes away all of those things. There are universities, there are colleges, I don't know what the rules are in this one, that say if you have a criminal record, you can't even apply to go to school here. There are some higher education institutions where they don't ever have people show up on campus. It's all remote. And they still don't let you apply if you have a felony. So here's a funny story. About 5 months ago, I was having a discussion in D.C. with about 50 of my colleagues, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, advocates, organizers, Black Lives Matter folks. And then we were going to walk over to the White House afterwards. So it was a 5 or 6 hour meeting followed by a meeting with the senior policy advisors to the President of the United States. And how exciting. Like, this is what I do for a living. I get a chance to talk to the people who talk to the president. And we walk over to the White House, and I'm walking along with the prosecutor from DeKalb County in Georgia. And we're talking about the progressive things he's doing. Even prosecutors are starting to figure out they need to do some things differently. And we get to the White House, and everyone gets this green pass. And I get this pink pass that says needs escort. And if you have a criminal record, you sort of like, oh, I know what this is about. Like, you just expect it, right? There's so many moments where your criminal record can get in the way of some opportunity, even when you're invited to the White House to have a discussion about mass incarceration and collateral consequences. I don't want the irony to be lost on you. And so I get to the last leg of security, and security is the White House, right? So there's serious security. And there's this burly Secret Service guy, and he says, you can't go any further. And I was like, why not? He said, because you have a pink pass, and you need to be escorted. I said, by who? He said, by whoever invited you here. I said, well, Roy Austin, the senior policy advisor to the president. He's like, yeah, he's going to have to come downstairs and get you. I'm like, oh, okay. So, I mean, it was really embarrassing. You know, I make light of it, but we're talking about a conviction record from 21 years ago. And so I go off to the side, and I'm emailing, and I'm texting, and so on. And I'm trying to get someone in the meeting to come back down and get someone to escort me. And so I'm 20 minutes now into a 1-hour meeting. And this young white intern comes through the door, and she says, are you? And I said, yes, I've been waiting. And she's like, oh, I'll take you. I'll escort you upstairs. And she grabs me, and the Secret Service guy's like, yeah, okay. And we go by, and we go to the elevator, and she turns around to me, and she's like, are you Mr. Jacobson? I was like, no, I'm Mr. Martin. She's like, oh, I think I grabbed the wrong person. Black man invited to White House, 21-year-old conviction, can't get in. Young white intern skips out in front of this Secret Service guy and grabs whoever she wants. Anyway, she ends up taking me to the meeting. I end up changing the tenor of the meeting, as you can imagine. And then I went to the Wall Street Journal and to the Washington Post and to anyone else who would listen. And they all wrote stories about it. And that story got me invited to the White House to have a meeting with President Obama. And it was a great meeting. It was a great conversation. And if you've been watching the news, our president is way out ahead of any other president on any of this stuff. And, you know, people are like, well, why can't he just take care of it all? Why can't he just wave a magic wand and just fix all this stuff? He can't. Let's be honest. Like, it took us 4.5 decades to get here. I think our president at this point is doing just about everything he can do. I think there's some moments where he shows, where he makes decisions that are a little bit counterintuitive or a bit schizophrenic on this stuff. I mean, he just passed a bill and signed into law, and this is going to land really hard for some people in the audience, but I'm going to say it out loud because it's about my beliefs. He just signed a bill a couple of days ago that brands the passport of everyone ever convicted of a sex offense so that when you travel out of the United States, wherever you go, you're labeled as a sex offender. So that's almost 1 million Americans, 850,000 Americans are on the sex offender registry. And I know people are sitting here like, oh, I watch MSNBC. I know who you're talking about. You're talking about those villains. Well, maybe they deserve to have their passport stamped. I'm also talking about the father who takes his child across state lines without the mother's permission and gets arrested. I'm talking about a guy who's 19 who dates a woman who's 17 or 16. There's a lot of nuance in there. But our president is way ahead of anyone else on this stuff. And during the Q&A, maybe we can talk about some of the things that the president is doing. And what's really exciting about what the president is doing is that much of it is driven by meetings that they're having with people like me. And you might say, wow, the president's like listening to people who serve time to make decisions about criminal justice. Well, you know what? If I was rebuilding the emergency room of a hospital, who would I want to talk to but like patients, right? And if I were thinking about schooling and teachers, I would want to talk to teachers. And if I were thinking about issues that impact veterans, I would want them at the table. Yet this is one of the only issues where the people most impacted by the system have not been part of the dialogue for a really long time. And that's not just the fault, I believe, of the people who built this system. It's also the fault of people who've been advocating to destroy this system. And why? Because of the tremendous amount of stigma associated with having a criminal record, right? Like, I'm standing here in front of you and I'm talking about crimes that I've committed. There has to be some people in the audience who's like, I've never heard this before. Like, most people with a criminal record don't want to talk about it. You know? Some people might even be so bothered that they get up and walk out. I'm not suggesting that's why he got up and walked out. But I'm teasing you. Keep going. Bathroom, right? So let me talk about a couple other things before I open it up. I think if there's a timekeeper here, help me out. As I get closer and closer to 10 minutes left for the lecture. Got it. Cool. Scared me. I can do this in 10 minutes. So here's where we are in terms of reform. So we talked about how many people are in prison, and the numbers are spot on, right? Like 2.2 million in prison on any given day. What I don't think was mentioned was another 5.6 million under some form of criminal justice supervision. So people often say, like, well, how do we end people going to prison? Well, let's build something else so that we can put people in this other place instead of sending them to prison. And that just hasn't worked. Everything has grown alongside each other. Parole, grown. Probation, grown. Electronic monitoring, grown. Alternatives to incarceration, drug and alcohol treatment programs, grown. And that may not seem like a bad thing, but it could be If a prosecutor says, I won't send you to jail, but I'll send you into this 18-month inpatient treatment program, you might say, well, that's a good thing, but it's not always a good thing. If that program is not a good fit for that person and doesn't match their needs, you can actually be doing what's called net widening. Anyone ever hear the term net widening? So I used to run an alternative to incarceration program, and if you sit in court and say to a judge, I'm here to take people into my drug and alcohol treatment program instead of them going to prison, well, guess what? Judges have no appetite for risk. And so if I was going to send this guy home, well, maybe I won't send him home. Maybe I'll send him to your 18-month drug and alcohol treatment program. Well, you might say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that if he comes to my program and he fails, then what do judges do? They already have the hammer over your head. They come down on you. So now I say, you know what? I sent you to that program. You didn't do well. I'm going to send you to jail for a year. He was better off if I left him alone. That judge probably would have sent him home. And so we have to think about that as we think about how do we end mass incarceration. The answer is not always how do you build something else over here. Because you know why? Our whole criminal justice system is built at this point. Maybe this is too much of a blanket statement, but I'm an advocate and I tend to make blanket statements. It's built on punitiveness. So let's talk about values for a moment, because that's another thing that's going to get us out of here. Because we might not all agree on the things I'm saying, but hopefully we can all agree on the kind of values we have as Americans. And it can't just be punitiveness. You cannot convince me that this country is just so evil that that's the only thing we focus on. I mean, prisons in other countries, in Germany, the deprivation of liberty is the punishment. You get locked up, that's the punishment. Everything else is rehabilitation. But not in our country. It's all punishment all the time. Even while you're in the system. Segregated housing units, solitary. It's like being punished while you're being punished. And the whole system is like that. When I was in prison, you'd walk on the walkway and you wouldn't look at the correction officers, because if you did, there's actually a charge called reckless eyeballing. Yeah, laugh, but I'm serious. Like, you go to the box for looking at a correction officer the wrong way. So to get out of here, we really need to think about, what do we really care about? Do we care about parsimony? Do we care about proportionality? Do we care about social justice? Do we care about citizenship? Because at sentencing, we knock people down a few notches. You get sentenced or you take a plea and a judge says, you know what, here's what I'm sentencing you to. You're going to go away. You're going to be in this prison. You're going to be hours away from home. You're going to wait for a parole board to let you out. And you're just like, it's very ceremonial. Like, you don't not become a citizen, but there's a lot of stuff in that moment to remind you that you're no longer like other citizens. And guess what? There's no ceremony to bring you back. We leave you there. That's where you stay. I mean, there's police officers around this country now that pull people over and the first question is, are you on parole or probation? Like, that's 65 million Americans have a criminal record. That's just who we are now. You know, we could sit here and say, like, there's this small group of people over here that do bad things, but that's just not true. With 65 million Americans having a criminal record, that's just who we are. It's in our DNA. Here's the problem with the reform movement right now, and I hate to call it a movement. I actually feel like we're having a series of moments. I'm not so convinced we're in a movement. And I think the Black Lives Matter folks have a lot to do with even the momentum that we're seeing right now in criminal justice reform. So here's why I say we have moments and not movements. So I come out of prison. I didn't just end up like this, right? Like, I got out, I owed $100,000 in fines, fees, restitution. That's the other thing. We're trying to pay for the system on the backs of the people in the system who are poor, which I mentioned at the top of the conversation. And so I get out, I owe $100,000. I got this college degree. I'm gung-ho. I'm ready to go. I visit about 50 employers within 30 days. Just about everyone turned me down. A couple of them said, oh, yeah, we'll give you the job, only to decide just a few hours later that they wouldn't give me the job. And I ended up getting a job making $16,000 a year answering the phones at the front desk of a law firm, a public interest law firm. And, you know, call it serendipity, call it faith, whatever you believe in, but the organization cared about ending mass incarceration. That's what they did. It was the work they did. They worked on discrimination issues, criminal justice, drug and alcohol, people with criminal records. And so I worked my way up through that law firm. I ended up working in 10 states around the country to pass laws, removing barriers to employment for people with criminal records. And then I realized I'm not going to go to law school, and I started feeling really disconnected from the people I care about, the constituents. and decided to leave to go work at a social service organization. But I still wanted to do advocacy work. So I built an advocacy unit inside of an organization that served 4,000 people with criminal records each year. And then I took over communications, and then I took over fundraising. I couldn't get a job making $16,000 a year 7 years earlier. At that point, I was running an agency with a $23 million budget with 212 people on staff. And then about 2 years ago, I started thinking about where we are as a country. Like, are we really having a movement, or are we having a series of moments? And if we're not having a movement, why aren't we? Like, what's missing here? And I took a week off, and it was at the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I'm sitting at home, and I'm with Joshua, who's my 3-year-old at the time. And I'm thinking, like, the statistics say that there's a huge chance that this child is going to end up locked up in this country. And I started thinking, well, what we're doing now doesn't feel like it's going to prevent that. It feels very incremental. The field feels really bogged down in incrementalism. And that's an indictment of, like, some of my colleagues and myself, because I did a lot of that incremental work for years. And I decided I wanted to be bolder. And I decided that if you talk to people who've had handcuffs on, they don't want incrementalism. They want something bold and audacious. So I talked to 250 people around the country. At that point, in my contact list, and my assistant Valerie's here, she can sign off on this, I have about 20,000 people in my contact list that I had met over the last 15 years. And we talked to about 250 of them, and that just kept coming out, particularly from people most impacted, that what's happening now doesn't feel like a response that's commensurate with the size of the problem. And so the first thing we did, I wrote a concept paper during that week. I sat with a lawyer friend of mine and asked her to just really, like, drill me. And we came up with a concept paper, and I went back to work and I resigned. I have a robbery conviction. I resigned from a job making $180,000 a year, just walked away. No grants in place, no nothing. Just a concept paper. And I did that because I'm often in front of audiences like this telling people, particularly people who live in white skin in this country, that you have a certain amount of privilege that people like me don't have. What does that mean? It means I can say this, you can say the same thing I say, and it'll be heard differently, and it'll be heard. And so if I'm telling other people to spend their privilege, I was like, well, wait a minute. You get to meet with Sandra Day O'Connor, you've met with Desmond Tutu, you've met with Richard Gere, you met with the Attorney General. Like, you have a certain level of privilege. What are you going to do with it? And I decided, like, well, you know what? Martin Luther King probably would have said, how can you have a movement without the voices of people most impacted leading that movement? And how do you change that? And so I thought about, how did I go from standing in Midtown Manhattan with no job, owing $100,000 a year, to meeting with some of the people I mentioned and moving policy forward? And so I decided I was going to launch a year-long leadership training program that would invest in other people like me from all across the country. I decided I was going to build an organization that would be a membership organization so that people like yourselves who want to be a part of this movement can become members. You can be a member of NAACP. You can be a member of Al Sharpton's organization. There's a number of organizations. They don't focus on this issue the way we do, and they're not willing to say the truth out loud the way we do. Why? Because a lot of their membership is tied back to people who are connected to the civil rights movement, and those folks have yet to be willing to give up the fact that that was a win that they might have let escape. But I also decided that we needed to be bold. And so we said, you know what? We want to cut the number of people under correctional supervision in half by 2030. Well, not only did people think I was crazy for quitting my job, but when I sent that email out, I can't tell you how many of my colleagues called me and said, are you okay? And there was one call in particular, and then I'll stop and I'll take questions. There's a woman who's been in the field for over 20 years. I won't say her name until I write my book. And she said, she called me up and she said, Glenn, you know, I'm sorry to hear you left the Fortune Society. I'm really happy that you're building something new. I wish you the best of luck, but I'm calling to say I think you're going to fail. And I said, well, why would you say that? She said, I just don't think you're going to find leadership amongst people who've been in prison. Not the kind of leadership you're looking for. And here it is, almost 2 years later, we've trained 120 people in 25 states who sit on governors' boards, who are on MSNBC and CNN, who have earned PhD degrees, who run their own social service agencies who have like the most interest in the outcome of these issues. Why? Because they're bonded together with 65 million other Americans in a shared trauma that'll never go away for the rest of their lives, but also because they still live in many of these communities that stand to benefit if we get this right. And so in some ways, Betty was right. I didn't find the kind of leaders I was looking for. I found people that were so much more amazing. And we create spaces for their voices to be heard the same way you guys created a space for me to come here and for my voice to be heard. And yet, remember this. I said I look historically, right? If you think going forward, this is daunting. Like what? Like all these people in prison, private prisons, all this stuff going on. How do you get to half by 2030? But if you look historically in this country, there's a roadmap to how to get to the finish line, because we've had other systems of oppression in this country, even ones that are mired in people gaining significantly economically from them, right? Think slavery. And yet at the same time, there's never been a movement without young people. There's never been a movement without the leadership of young people or of students. Why? Because you're going to inherit this madness I just described to you over the last 45 minutes. And that's why I think you guys should pay close attention, because it's yours. And that's unfortunate. And yet at the same time, as I said, there's something you can do about it. You can walk out of here and say, oh, I heard a pretty good talk. It was really interesting. Let me get back to whatever I was doing. Or you could say, is there one thing I can do? Is there a person I can talk to? Is there some bill I can sign on to? Is there some membership I can join? Or can I tell the truth about the time I had handcuffs on? Thank you for the opportunity. So I think there's a couple of mics in the audience somewhere. Yeah? No? Well, I'll take questions. I'll share my mic. Yep. Can you stand up? I'm actually going to give you my mic. I'm going to move around. I got my own talk show.
What ended up happening to your brother?
Oh, really good. Wow, you're so thoughtful. So my older brother, Sheldon, went into the military and became a federal correction officer for 10 years. And now he's a U.S. Marshal. And I forgive him, but you can imagine Thanksgiving like at my house, right? But the reason I asked you to remind me is because my younger brother is also doing well. He's running one of the largest sports gyms in New York under the MetLife building, where he's dealing with corporate executives who make millions of dollars, helping them train. And the reason I asked you to remind me is because you can actually pinpoint where opportunity played a huge role in the lives of myself and my two brothers and changed the trajectory of our lives. It's clear to me if my brother would have stayed in Brooklyn, New York at the time, he would have ended up locked up too. He had a hot temper, he had a lot of courage, he didn't take a lot of crap, and he probably would have ended up locked up. But yeah, he has a white picket fence and a house in the hills in San Diego.
How would you change the term felony?
That's a good question. How would I change the term felony? I'm sorry to keep using you earlier, like in all my stories. You were like Arthur, you were like all these different people. Anything that's humanizing, right? So people try to look for one term that they can use, like returning citizen is a term that's used. In fact, the city of Philadelphia literally decided they would not write anything about people with criminal records that's not labeled as returning citizen. I mean, I have trouble when you try to find just one term. I just say people, person, individual, musician, you name it. Anything that humanizes folks. And it's not easy to make the transition. But I guess I've been doing it long enough now that, again, I can stand here for an hour and not use any of those terms. But as you write, I mean, the Charles Colson Task Force on Public Safety, which was just launched, a Blue Ribbon Commission for a year by Congress, very deliberately in their report back to Congress said that they weren't going to use dehumanizing language. The Department of Correction in New York State doesn't use the language. Again, the city of Philadelphia doesn't use it. But there's no one term that works for everything. It's just language that humanizes. Can you pass that down, please?
So who's to determine who should and should not get a pink slip? Because so many of the judges who are giving you this slip, so-called, don't believe that you're humanized. They think you're a thug or a criminal,
Hold the mic for a second. Can you pass it back, please? Can you describe the pink slip concept for me again?
Like you said, when you went to the White House, they gave you a pink slip because you were convicted of a crime.
Right.
So like, who's to decide that you get that pink slip or don't get that pink slip 10 years later?
Got it. That's helpful. Because when adults hear pink slips, we think about losing our jobs, at least if you're over a certain age. So that's a good question. And the question for me is about perpetual punishment. How long do we punish people in this country, and who makes decisions? I remember having lunch with Richard Gere, who is a Buddhist, who traveled all over the world to talk to people about imprisonment and incarceration. And he talked about how in many of the countries, believe it or not, in the Middle East, they just couldn't grab the concept of punishment beyond what the judge gave a person. Like the idea that you couldn't vote. Like they let people vote in Saudi Arabia, like in prison. Whereas in this country, there's only 2 states where you actually never lose the right to vote, Maine and Vermont. Does anyone know why? Because there's so many black people there. And so I think it's the right question. But so let's say you don't care about like, oh, there has to be a time when people need to get past the criminal record. Let's say you just care about the research. There's actual research from Al Blumstein that says that after 7 years, even a person convicted of a pretty serious crime, armed robbery, shows no more of a propensity to reoffend than someone who's never been convicted of a crime. And one of the reasons is that age is one of the most significant determining factors in whether a person continues to engage in criminal behavior. Why? Because as you get older, you have less of an appetite for risk. But in this country, we don't think like that. And yet, there's all this data over the last 10 years that helps us to start thinking like that. I mean, President Obama signed to ban the box order. If you guys are not familiar with it, the idea that a person should be able to apply for a job, be found qualified, otherwise qualified, and then the criminal record should be taken into account. And a big part of him signing that executive order was him reading the research that said, you know what, there's just no factual basis for us to continue to punish people. But how are we going to get out of it? It's not going to be the research. If you think of HIV/AIDS in this country, you guys are too young to remember that moment, like when people in this country were just shunning folks with the disease and letting them die, and sometimes not allowing them into hospitals and letting them die in the street in front of the hospital. It wasn't the research that got us out of that. It was when Americans finally said, you know what, that's just not how we treat sick Americans. Like it was a value moment. And until we get to a value moment, trying to do it in a more concrete way, like how many years out and what type of conviction, because criminal justice, unlike anything else, you don't need one court case to pass. You don't need one bill to pass. You don't need one court decision. We got here through 1 million cuts. And the only way to get out of here is through like 1 million Band-Aids. And so there won't be just one morning where we hit a tipping point because we passed a law, but hopefully there will be a moment where we hit a tipping point because Americans just start thinking differently about people who've been in the system.
I just want to say you've given a fascinating talk today, so I appreciate it. And wanted to get your take on something. I have a for-profit company that I started in Newark that hires people that have barriers to employment, which is what I like to phrase it. Anything from, records, carjacking, homicide, sex offenders, all these kinds of things. But I have about 10 people working at a site in Brooklyn right now today on a construction site. Do you think that part of us getting out of this is jobs and creating a systemic narrative that many people who have the resources buy into the notion to get these kinds of folks jobs?
Yeah. I love questions where the answer is in the question. Of course, right? So a couple things I'll say. One, we live in America where like the first question people ask each other is like, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living? And the reason we do that is because so much of who we are is tied to our jobs, unfortunately. Sometimes our identity is tied to our jobs. But healthcare is tied to our jobs, eye care, vision, dental, there's so many things tied to actually having a job, your self-esteem, and part of feeling like you have a community. And there's no better way to get people to decide to reoffend than to remind them every single day they're not one of us. Then why do I give a crap? If I can't vote, and if I can't live here, and I can't work here, and I can't go to school here, then you're not like me, right? You're shunning me, and you know what? I don't care about you if you don't care about me. Back to the top of my conversation. Second thing is, when I was at the Fortune Society, we had 4,000 people a year walk through the door. I'd say about 85% of them started with, I need a job. And what's fascinating about that is, a lot of them didn't need a job right away. They needed mental health services. They needed a place to live. They needed medication. But it was a driver. It was like, I need resources. I need money. I want to be independent. I want to take care of myself. I want to take care of my family. I want to pay off that $100,000 in fines, fees, restitution. You see, I'm still angry about that. So the answer is yes. I think it's a big gateway. But the caveat I would say is that there is no silver bullet. Employment is a big one because it's a driver for the individual, and it's a way to get people to be part of society again. But we got to remember there's no silver bullet. Why? Because people in prison are individuals just like everyone in this room. And there's no one thing that can help every single person in this room. There's a question back here. I really feel like Oprah Winfrey right now. Here.
Hi. Can you explain why a person owes $100,000 when they come out? What that's about?
Yeah. Sure. So I must be killing you with this camera, right? Okay.
Good job.
Okay, cool. I didn't hear what you asked me, though. What did you say?
When you're done, I got a question.
Oh, okay, good. All right. The cameraman has a question. I'm killing it in here. Okay, so the question was, how do you get $100,000 in fines, fees, and restitution? Well, if you watch Ferguson, you get a sense of how this stuff happens, right? Like you have a city where essentially a huge proportion of their general fund came from fines. So if you look at almost any legislation in the country, when the legislative session is done and you pull up the bills and you search for the word fines and fees in the criminal justice section of their legislation, almost every session you will see new fines and fees. And why? Because we're having a national conversation about what? $80 billion. That's what we spend to run our prisons. If you bring in the courts and everything else, $260 billion each year. So there's a question about how do you pay for that? And these very bright legislators, are there any legislators in the room? These very bright legislators decided, I know how to pay for it. We're going to make the people who serve time pay for it. And we're going to make it mandatory so that judges have no way to waive it. And so as soon as I walked out of court, I walked out with about $45,000 in debt. And that just continued to grow for a bunch of different reasons while I was on the inside. And you might say, well, that's a lot. And it is a lot. But the average person walks out with about $5,000 to $10,000 that they owe. And if they have a child support order in place, forget about it. People come out of prison 23, 24 years old owing $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 in child support. And so do I not believe people should take care of their kids? Of course they should. But what I'm telling you is that the way our child support rules work now, even if you're in prison, prison is defined as voluntary unemployment. And so your child support continues to accumulate while you're there, even though most people in prison make about $20 an hour. I know the cameraman has a question. 2 more questions. I'm going to take the cameraman because he keeps capturing my good side. Hold on.
First of all, congratulations on being a great American success story.
Thank you.
I taught re-entering citizens at Rutgers, and I'm big on definitely rehabilitation, but at the same time, I'm old enough like you to remember New York in the 1980s when you went to Times Square to buy drugs, not to take your kids to Toys R Us, when the highways were lined with burned out stolen cars. And in 1990 itself, when there were 2,200 murders in the city, that's 6 to 7 homicides a day. And Rudy Giuliani brought all of that down with law enforcement to the point that now we're down to fewer than 1 murder per day. So where do you strike the balance between law enforcement and, I guess, less law enforcement?
I'm not giving him back the mic. Who would have thought that the cameraman would be the person to ask the hard question? Okay, cool. It's a good question. Yeah, no, it's a great question. Everyone else is being polite. That was a great question. So every community that's like Bedford-Stuyvesant that I grew up in has a community right next to it that enjoys public safety. That's all across America. Communities that are the most violent, that has the most crime, that has the most policing and incarceration, always have a community right next door that enjoys public safety. So first thing I'd say is communities that are violent usually have a really small number of people who are committing violence, an extremely small number of people. But that's not how we police those communities. We police them as if every single person in the community is committing violence every single day, right? So I want you to shake loose of the notion that there are entire communities that are violent, because those communities just wouldn't survive, right? The communities would just totally go away because everyone would kill each other, and that's not the case. The data supports what I'm saying now, that if you look at David Kennedy's work at John Jay, very small number of people who are actually the problem in communities, and the people who live in those communities know who those people are. If you live in the hood and you're in the audience right now, you know who's hustling. You know who's causing problems. You know which building is the problem, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about the community next door for a second. In fact, let's do a little exercise. My friends who are community organizers, they do this all the time. I love it. Close your eyes for a minute, please. Think about the day in your life that you felt most safe. The day you felt most safe in your entire life. And think about what was going on around you. And think about who is there. And what are you doing? Are you inside? Are you outside? Are you at the beach? Are you in the park? Is your grandmother there? Is your uncle there? Are your children there? But you feel really safe in that moment. What does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And then open your eyes. So who saw police officers in their thinking? Who saw shotguns? Who saw prisons? Who saw, because you know why? None of that stuff has very little to do with public safety. Police officers, law enforcement comes in and cleans up the mess in communities where that's all we mobilize to respond to crime. I live in Harlem, New York. Whenever there's a crime, you get a couple of police cars sitting around, you get guard towers go up, and that's what they mobilize. If you walk down Fifth Avenue in New York, it cuts right through Harlem, and then you get to the Ralph Lauren Polo Mansion, and you're still on Fifth Avenue, and you look back, and there's all this crime stuff going on, and now you're in one of the safest communities in New York, period. Is it because there's more police over here? No, actually there's usually a lot less. I know what there's more of over here. There's more access to education. There's more access to health care. There's more access to jobs. Because those are the things that create safety. You can't think using the current paradigm to figure out how to get out of this. Giuliani came in and he decided, let's lock up everything black and brown that moves in New York. He did make that decision. That was a policy decision. I know those people. They still live in Harlem. They're in the street. They're still addicted to drugs. They may not be committing crime. Those people didn't just go away. They didn't just say, thank you, Mr. Giuliani, I'm out of here. Many of them went to prison for long stretches. Many of them are still addicted to drugs. Many of them are still homeless. You name it. While there are other communities right next door that don't handle public safety that way. So if you guys are going to own the future, you can do what we did in the past, and you know what you're going to do? You're going to get what you've always gotten. Or you can decide maybe there's another way. And if you don't believe me and you've been living in New York, in America so long that this is all you know, then you know what? Do what most people hate to do, but you probably should do, which is to look outside of the United States. There are countries in Europe where you commit a murder and you'll never go to prison for more than 12 years. Period. And they're not less safe than America. I think the statistic is we had one mass shooting for just about every day last year in America. This is a violent country with a violent culture, but it doesn't have to be. And our response to it doesn't have to be prison cells. Why? Because it just hasn't worked. 45 years is enough time for us to know it hasn't worked. Are we done? Yeah, we're done. So there was one. Yeah, there's one over here. So I'll take this last one and then I'm done. You guys got me all worked up. I forgot you said 2.
I have a big voice. Tell me about prevention. What can we do to prevent young people from going to a life of crime in the first place? That's how we're going to reduce the
What can we do to get young? What can we do around prevention? What can we do to get young people to stay away from crime? Young people have a huge appetite for risk. I talked about that earlier. And so it's hard to get them to understand how the punishment should probably drive their decision making. Most people actually don't know what sort of punishment they're facing. When I got to court for the robbery I got arrested for, the first offer was 20 to 40. I had no clue I was facing 20 to 40 years for that behavior. And most people, even with the most minor crimes, don't have a sense of what that punishment is going to look like for the rest of their lives. My answer is going to seem really maybe not as pragmatic as you would like, but I just think that if you help young people to be exposed to as many opportunities as possible, they end up gravitating in the right direction. And then when they don't and they make a bad decision, you don't crush them, you don't destroy them. If you look in Alaska, this is the last thing I'll say and I'll stop. In Alaska, what they're doing now is pretty interesting in some places. Because Alaska, people are so distant from each other, and there's fishing towns, traditional law enforcement was locking people up for things like vagrancy and alcoholism and other things until those very communities were like, wait a minute, if you keep locking people up and taking them away, we lose our commerce, we lose our families, people lose their homes. And they asked, can we use what's called restorative justice, and if you've never heard this, go Google it, as a way to respond to people breaking the law. And they do it. And restorative justice, I'd suggest you look it up because we don't have any more time, but it is a way for communities to come together and decide as a community with the victim and the offender, I don't like those words, but just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, at the table agreeing to what the punishment should look like. And I'm hopeful that the restorative justice concept can be a way to undo the system that we're currently in. Thank you again.